Today we're going to be learning Yevamot Ayin Dalet. We're going to make a little seder from the beginning of the chapter. What we've done so far in this chapter is we've been talking about one word. Okay, we started our chapter in Yevamot Daf Ayin. We're now on Ayin Dalet, and until now we've been dealing with the word ha'arel. Okay, ha'arel. Skip for a minute the next two words. Lo yochlu b'truma. That's what we've been trying to deal with. So we talked about ha'arel not eating truma. Right now we're in the middle of, I'm not going to go through everything we did, but we talked about, what's the source? Where do we get it from? Gezeira shava from Pesach. We had two basic approaches. Shava I muted everyone. Sorry. Sorry. We had Shava Sachir by Pesach. So we're going to learn gezeira shava to there. That was Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Akiva learned ish, right? And we keep going back to this mantra of his Arel kitameh. So anything we say for tameh is going to be true for an arel, according to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva's pasuk, which we're going to darshan even more today, ish, right, who's a zav or tsaruav ozav, can't eat kodesh. We're going to see what the kodesh they can't eat. We'll talk about this, right? But kodeshim lo yochal, the exact words. Ish mizera aharon. We're going to darshan mizera aharon. What that comes to say instead of mibnei aharon. Okay, the reason we're going to get to this pasuk, you'll see in a minute, because soon we're going to get to deal with finally the next words in the Mishnah, which are cholat me'im. Okay, so until now we dealt with the arel. We had those two approaches. How we know arel can't eat truma, either the gezeira shava from Pesach or the words in this pasuk ish, which come to include, besides just a tameh can't eat truma, also the arel can't eat truma. That was just included in the extra word of the ish. By the way, it never says truma in that pasuk. Today we're going to have to figure out how you learn from that pasuk you can't eat truma, okay? Because it says bakodashim, which are sanctified things. Could be truma, could be sacrificial meat, it could be something else. That we'll get to later. Then we were in the middle of, what about an arel eating maaser sheni? Once we talked about an arel not eating truma, we now move to this question: can an arel eat maaser sheni or not? I'm not going to go through again what maaser sheni is, right? Those fruits you bring to Jerusalem, right? We talked about that already. So what we did yesterday was very simple. We said, even though maybe it got a bit complicated, but the concept was very simple. We said, okay, Rav Sheshet said, arel cannot eat maaser sheni. How do we know it? Because there's a list in Mishna Bikurim, chapter 2, of all the differences between truma and bikurim on the one hand, and maaser sheni on the other, and it doesn't list arel, so it must be the arel can't do it. To which the Gemara said, no, that's not a proof. Could have just left it off the list. And then we had to prove, how do we know he left things off the list? We jumped to Mishnah chapter 2, Mishnah 2, rather than Mishnah 1. We proved from there that things were left off the list. There it was comparing maaser and bikurim to truma. And then Rav Ashi at the very end of the daf and beginning of today's went back and said not only that, but in the first Mishnah, our Mishnah that we were dealing with, there's also two things that were left off the list. So the failed attempt of Rav Sheshet to learn this. So the Gemara now tries to we're going to bring three more sources. Okay, I'll give you the structure until we get to the bottom of Amud Aleph. Three sources to try to prove it, all unsuccessful. Then they're going to bring Rabbi Yitzchak, who actually says the same thing as Rav Sheshet, that an arel cannot eat maaser sheni, and then he proves it. So then we're going to be ending up with a proof and showing that the arel cannot eat maaser sheni. But first, we're going to have three failed attempts. Tashma, starting from line 2 of our daf. And then, by the way, what I wanted to get to is right after that, we're going to get to the next words in the Mishnah. We're finally going to move on from the arel and get to the next line, which is called hatmeim can't eat truma. And then we're going to deal with that. So here starts the bright. What do you see here, Dave? Pashut. It says, this is, we've talked about this a few times. If when you did the brit milah, you left some of the parts of the skin there that you weren't supposed to, right? What they are, we're not going to get into, but if you leave parts of the skin there that had to have been, that basically prevent your brit milah from being a good brit milah, which basically means you're an arel, which is what we're looking for. You cannot eat truma. You can't eat korban Pesach. You can't eat sacrificial meat. Okay, you might notice something a little strange. Pesach and kodshim. Kodshim is sacrificial meat, so is Pesach. We'll get back to that in a minute. And lo b'maaser, and not maaser. Now, what is maaser? Maaser can mean a few things. There's two basic types of maaser. There's maaser of your produce, And then there's maaser of your animals. The maaser of your animals, your 10th animal, ends up having to be brought to the temple and sacrificed there. The maaser of your produce also splits into two. There's the first tithe and the second tithe. That's what we're dealing with. Maaser sheni, it's the second one you take. The first one is the one that goes to the Levim, and the second one is the one that you bring yourself to Jerusalem, and that's the one we're dealing with. So maaser can be one of three potential things. Okay, so first one of two, and then within the first option, if it's dagan, if it's produce, it could split into two, rishon or sheni. So what do they say here? First, they assume my lav maaser dagan, right? When they say not maaser, they assumed right away it must be maaser dagan. You'll see why in a minute, because right, if it was maaser behema, it's basically kohen, and kohen was already listed. So lo maaser behema. So then they say, if you're going to say it's maaser behema, and then it has nothing to do with our topic, because it doesn't say anything about an uncircumcised person not being able to eat this maaser sheni, it's talking about animal tithes. So they say maaser behema hainu kodashim, but it would be talking about a maaser behema separate from kodashim. Maaser behema is included in kodashim. So if number 3 in the list is kodashim, which includes maaser behema, number 4 in the list, which is maaser, can't be maaser behema, to which they ask, what I kind of hinted to you before, which is, wait a minute, if you're going to say it can't be maaser behema because it already says kohen, well then it shouldn't say Pesach if it already says kohen, right? But litamech milotanan Pesach bekatani kodashim. Pesach and kohen are listed separate. So if that's the case, you could list maaser behema and kohen separately. So they say, no. Even if Pesach is listed separately, there's a reason for that. As opposed to there'd be absolutely no reason to list maaser behema separately from kohen. What's the reason? Now remember, where does it say kol areh lo yochal bo in korban Pesach? Okay, so therefore, bishlama Pesach v'kohen tzrifim. That makes sense that you're going to need it to be listed separately, because the itana Pesach, what would you have said if it just said Pesach? Right, we're going to have to say, what if it just said Pesach, and what if it just said kohen? Could you learn one from the other? So if it had just said Pesach, obviously you wouldn't necessarily be able to learn to all other sacrifices, because, right, mishum da'arilut Pesach tiva specifically says kol areh lo yochal bo by Pesach. So you wouldn't necessarily you would have assumed not necessarily any other sacrifice. Therefore, if it had Pesach, it would have to have kohen also. But what if you just had kohen? That would include Pesach and everything else, and that would have been fine. The itana kohen, not really. Why? Hava amina my kohen Pesach. If you just say kohen, you might have thought that kohen is defined as what? Pesach. Pesach kohen, but not other kohen. This is like the toshav sachir. Remember, we did the same thing. We said, kind of, you don't need the other one. Once you say the eved who stays forever, then obviously the eved who's only there for 6 years, right? And then we said, no, well, if you didn't have both, you would have thought the definition of one is the other, right? It's used, both are there in order to define what does kohen mean. It doesn't mean only Pesach, it means everything else as well. So now they say, therefore, right? That's why you need Pesach, and that's why you need kohen. But there'd be absolutely no reason for maaser behema to stand alone. So therefore, we're back to where we wanted, which is it must be maaser dagan. Okay, so now they say, what's the answer though? Because again, we're trying to prove that Arel can't eat maaser sheni. So we've now proved the maaser in that braita, which says Arel cannot eat maaser, must be maaser sheni. To which they say, right, at least has to be maaser dagan as opposed to maaser behema, right? That comes from your produce and not from your animal. The Gemara says, ela maaser rishon. You could very simply say it's talking about the Levi's tithe, the one you give to the Levi. Now, why would that be any different than maaser sheni? Well, it depends. So let's take truma. Truma goes to the kohen, and we know, we've learned this many times, a non-kohen can't eat truma. What about the maaser that goes to the Levi? What if you're a visit, right? The maaser that goes to the Levi is basically to give the Levi food. It doesn't have sanctity like truma does, right? Truma is a very high sanctity. We've talked about that many times, right? Tumantara, we're very strict about, right? It goes another level. There's all sorts of things that you have to burn it if it gets tameh. Maaser rishon is a little bit different, and it's actually unclear whether a non-Levi is allowed to eat it. So if I go to a Levi's house and they serve me food and their food is from the maaser, am I allowed to eat it or not? So they say the following: if you distinguish and you hold maaser rishon, you treat it strictly, like for example, that a non-Levi can't eat it, then it makes sense to say that we distinguish here between maaser rishon and maaser sheni. And the RL can't eat maaser rishon, but can eat maaser sheni. And that Braita was only referring to maaser rishon. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Meir he. You'd have to say that Braita goes by the approach of Rabbi Meir. Because Rabbi Meir has a strict approach about maaser rishon. He holds, as opposed to others who don't hold this, he holds that maaser rishon is forbidden to non-Levi. So therefore, since he holds it stricter, we can say that this source that says an Arel can't eat the maaser is only talking about the maaser rishon, and it's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Not everyone would agree with it. And then we have absolutely no proof for maaser sheni. Tashma, next source. This is going to be very similar. Miditani Rabbi Akiva barav midifti. Arel asur b'shtei maasrot. Now, if it's asur in 2 maaser, remember, we said in essence there's 2, although really there's 3, right? Because the maaser, there's maaser be'ema, maaser dagan, but maaser dagan splits into rishon and sheni. So right now they're going to assume if it's shtei maasrot, ma'ila v'cha maaser dagan, v'cha maaser be'ema, and then that includes maaser sheni. To which they say again, we're going to answer this just like we answered before, or reject it just like we rejected before. Hachanami maaser rishon v'Rabbi Meir. No, when it says maaser, it means within dagan. Right, it's maaser be'ema, maaser dagan, but in maaser dagan, we're only talking about maaser rishon, which again has a stricter law specifically according to Rabbi Meir. Third source, Tashma. Let's learn from here. Onen asur b'maaser umutar b'truma u'b'para. We're going to have source very similar to those Mishnayot in Bikurim, except they're comparing different things, but it's the same idea. We're going to do like we're comparing truma, para, and maaser, as opposed to truma, bikurim, and maaser. So an onen can't eat maaser, but can eat truma. We learned that already. A kol zal, basically that excludes an onen. And as it means, right, an onen can eat, kol zar can't eat. You have to be a non-kohen, but if you're a kohen and you're an onen, you can. And para. You can also do the para aduma even if you're an onen. Tvul yom, asur b'truma, mutar b'para, b'maaser. Okay, if you went to the mikveh in the morning, but didn't yet, the sun hasn't set. So you can't eat truma. You can eat maaser, and the famous halacha we did yesterday, which is you can do the para aduma. Remember, that was what we started yesterday. The Tful Yom could do the para aduma, famous machloket between the Prushim and the Tzdukim, because ish tahor, right? The hizaha tahor michlal, he must have been a little tameh. That means he's a Tful Yom, he can do that. Mechusar kipurim asur b'para mutar b'truma b'maaser. If you haven't brought your korban yet, okay, again, these are all different stages. Remember these because we're going to deal with them later today. Okay, a person becomes impure. Let's say it's an impurity that has a korban associated with it as well, like a zav or a zava. For example, a zava sees three discharges, and a woman who's bleeding for 3 days, not in her regular time, and there's a zava. I can get into all the details of that, but both those people have to wait 7 clean days. On the 7th day, they go to the mikveh in the morning. So already they can eat. Let's just go through the stages, and this will be helpful for later in the daf. They go to the mikveh, they can already eat maaser. They're a tful yom. They can already do the paraduma if they want, right? They can be the sprinkler of the paraduma waters. They can mix the waters. Then they wait for the sun to set, fully set, Seder Kochavim, first Mishnah in Brachot, right? When can you say Shema at night from Seder Kochavim? And the Mishnah had described it as the time that the Kohanim eat their truma. So truma, you can already eat at night. But the next day you have to bring a sacrifice still. Because on the 8th day, if you're a zav or a zava, and if a zav you saw 3 times, if you saw only 2 times, you have to wait the 7 clean days, you don't bring a sacrifice. We'll get back to that today also, so remember that. But basically, you have to still bring a korban, and we're going to see what that prevents you from doing until you bring the korban is to eat sacrificial meat. You can't eat the meat until you bring the korban. So now, mechusar kipurim is that person who hasn't yet brought the korban, and the more, whether it's already nighttime of, after the 7th day, the beginning of the 8th day, or the morning before they brought their korban, their sacrifice, they're called mechusar kipurim. What can't you do when you're in that stage? Asur b'para, you can't deal with the paraduma. So when we said a tful yom could, we didn't mean a tful yom who has to bring a sacrifice. We meant a tful yom who, let's say, came in contact with the sheretz, and the sheretz made him tameh, and he goes to the mikveh the next morning, and then he's a tful yom. I think he can even go that day. Umutar b'truma b'maaser. But what did we say? Maaser you can eat for sure once you go to the mikveh, and truma you can eat once the sun sets full sunset, right? State of Kochavim, stars come out, but you don't have to wait to bring your korban. So again, they're setting up all these differences. So now what's the point? In Ita, if an arel was forbidden, it should have said, arel asur b'truma umutzar. If an arel could eat maaser, it should have been listed here. This is exactly the proof we used yesterday. Arel asur b'truma umutar b'para u'b'maaser. Okay, it should have said, an arel can't eat truma. It should have been listed as a difference and permitted to a para and maaser. The fact that it's not listed must mean the arel is forbidden. So in order to reject this, the Gemara says very simply, Hi, Tana de Rabbi Akiva he. I told you we come back to this. Once Rabbi Akiva learns ish, the rabot ha'arel, well, then an arel is exactly like a tameh. And then basically we're going to say this whole source is only Rabbi Akiva's opinion, but we don't hold that way. Yes, if you're treating arel like a tameh, then you're right. An arel will not be able to eat maaser. But maaser sheni. But if you don't treat an arel like a tameh, because you're not Rabbi Akiva, then you don't necessarily learn that. So basically, this Braita doesn't help us because we don't all hold like Rabbi Akiva. And we're looking for one who doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva. It's obvious to Rabbi Akiva that you don't eat maaser sheni. We want a proof that even those who disagree with Rabbi Akiva still hold that you can't eat maaser sheni. So this didn't help us. Now, just as an aside, they say, Ditanya. Okay, first of all, how do we know that Rabbi Akiva holds arel ketameh? We already know this. Rabbi Akiva omer ish lerabot ta'arel. Okay, that's very simple. Now they want to know uman tana de palagaled Rabbi Akiva. Who's the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Akiva about this issue? The answer is Tana de Rabbi Yossi Abavli. Now, you might have read this quickly and think it's Rabbi Yossi Abavli. No, it's the Tana Kama who appears in the machloket with Rabbi Yossi Abavli. That Tana who disagrees with him is the one who disagrees with Rabbi Akiva as well. How do we know this? Because now we're going to try to find someone who holds against Rabbi Akiva of some detail he mentioned in that Braita, because we just said that Braita is Rabbi Akiva. And now we're going to see, here you'll see, Ditanya, Srifat onen umechusar kippurim kshera. If there's an onen who burns the paraduma, or a mechusar kippurim who burns the paraduma waters, it's kshera. Now, what did Rabbi Akiva say? Mechusar kippurim, go back to the Braita, assuming that's Rabbi Akiva. Mechusar kippurim asur b'para. Can't do the paraduma mechusar kippurim. And this Tana says he can. So this must be the Tana who disagrees with him. Rabbi Yossi Abavli Omer, like Rabbi Akiva, onen kshera mechusar kippurim psula. So there you have it. That this is the Tana who disagrees with Rabbi Akiva. That was just a small aside. That was 3 attempts to prove arel can't eat maaser sheni. All of them did not work. Right? 2, because we said maaser doesn't mean maaser sheni, it means maaser rishon. And the third one, because we basically pushed it aside and we just said, oh, that's Rabbi Akiva. That doesn't teach us anything about those who disagree with him. Next, V'af Rabbi Yitzchak savar arel asur b'maaser. You might remember a few days ago, you might not, but we were darshaning all the psukim by Pesach, and then we said, what do they do with the word mimenu? And they said, mimenu, and then they said, oh, that's Rabbi Yitzchak. And I said, I'm not going to explain it now. We're going to get to it on Daf Ayin Dalet, and here we are. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, arel is asur b'maaser. Ta'amar Rabbi Yitzchak, how do we know this? Because he says, minayin la'arel shasur b'maaser. Here we're going to get it. What's your proof? Ne'emar mimenu b'maaser, v'ne'emar mimenu b'pesach. Here we get to the mimenu drasha. It says mimenu b'pesach. It says mimenu b'maaser. Ma mimenu hamor b'pesach arel asur bo. By Pesach, the word mimenu appears, and we know an arel can't eat Pesach, korban Pesach. Af mimenu hamor b'maaser arel asur bo. Okay, so because it says there mimenu, it says there mimenu, we learn gezeira shava. Okay, where does it say mimenu? So actually it says mimenu 3 times by Pesach, 3 times by maaser. Okay, we're going to get to all this in a minute. So I'm not going to read them all right now. Hold off. But we're going to basically say now, mufne. It must be that at least one of those places is unnecessary. Why? So remember the laws of gezeira shava. Right? First basic laws, you can only teach gezeira shava 2 words, right? Again, 2 words. Each one appears the same word, although sometimes you find them a little different, but let's go with the basic. 2 of the same words, in this case, it's mimenu, appear in this different places. We can learn what's true for one to the other. So the first rule is you have to have a tradition about this. You can't just make it up yourself. But number 2, we say, you can learn gezeira shava, but if we question it, we say, wait, one's more strict and maybe you can't learn from one to the other. Like in our case, Pesach is more strict. Maaser sheni is more lenient. Maybe you wouldn't be able to learn it. Well, you can ask a question and knock out the gezeira shava only if the psukim, all the references to the psukim are necessary. But if there's one unnecessary, right, in one place, it's unnecessary. You don't need it for the pshat of the Rav for any kind of reason, or a no drasha, and it's free, as we call mufne. Then, even if you have a question, right, we can say it doesn't matter. Okay, even if you have a difficulty, I should say, not a question. If you raise a difficulty, the gezeira stands. Although we saw there's one opinion that says both sides have to be mufne, remember? And if only one side's free, you could still knock it out. So now the Gemara is going to say, it must be mufne, right? Mufne. Di'i lo mufne. Ikal mifrach. Mala Pesach. Ken chayvim ala mishum pigul no tabertane. Right? Pesach has all these chumrot about it. For instance, right? There's laws of pigul, no tar, right? These are all things that relate to sacrifices and tanit. Whereas it's not true for maaser sheni. So the Gemara says, lie, afnuya mufne. It really is unnecessary. How do we know? So my mufne, which reference to the word, now we're going to have 6 mimenus, 3 by Pesach, 3 by maaser, and only one of them is going to be unnecessary. But which one? So Amar Ava, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak. Tlata mimeni k'tiveh b'Pesach. Okay, what are the mimenu? Okay, it says, you can look in Rashi. Al tochlu mimenu na, don't eat it raw. There's mimenu. Right? And then it says, right, and not cooked in water, you have to roast it. Number 2, lo totiru mimenu aboker, don't leave over anything from it till the morning. Number 3, vehanotar mimenu aboker ba'esh yisrofu. Whatever's left from it, again, from it is the mimenu, the next morning you have to burn. So which one is unnecessary? What are they all needed for? Chad legufe, one you need for its own sake, to say, when we say don't eat it raw and you have to cook it in water, right, and not cooked in water, it has to be roasted, mimenu, only the meat, not matzah and maror, okay? Number 2, chad gezeira shava. The second one, lo totiru mimenu aboker, unnecessary. That's the one that's unnecessary. We already got our answer. Number 3, the chad lemanda. Okay, so now here it's split into 2. There's 2. It starts up, it says, don't leave it over till the morning. And then it says, and whatever's left in the morning, you burn. So there's 2 ways to understand this verse. One is, the pasuk is telling you, normally, we talked about this just yesterday. If you have a negative commandment, you get lashes. If you have a positive commandment, you don't get lashes. But there's certain negative commandments that are exceptions to the rule. One of them is called lav anitak laseh. So when you have a lo taseh, a negative commandment, but then you have a solution to what happens if you mess up. What do? I'll give you the easiest example. It says, Hashev, lo tuchalit alein. If you find something on the street, you can't ignore it. Hashev teshivim. Return it. So that means if you don't return a lost item, because it's a lav anitak laseh, and there's a solution to the problem, right? One is don't ignore it, but if you ignore it, right, pick it up. That's what you're supposed to do and return it. Hashev teshivim, go return it to someone. So that's the solution to the problem. That means you don't get lashes because there's a way to resolve it, right? Normally lashes is viewed also as rehabilitative, right? So here it's giving you a different way to rehabilitate, fix the problem. So notar is a great example because don't leave it over till the next morning, right? Pesach has to be eaten that night. So we eat it Seder night, right? We don't eat it called Pesach anymore. They would eat it that night. You can't leave it over till the morning. What if you did? Well, you burn it. That's your solution. Now, obviously these solutions are not perfect, right? It's not a perfect solution, but that's what you do with it. So they say, one opinion says, what's that coming there for? So it's coming to teach you, it's a lavani takla. Say you wouldn't get lashes for it. So according to that, I did diktiv notach tiv nami mimenu. So now it's just balancing the verse. It said, don't leave it over. So then it said, and if you leave it over, right? So then it's necessary for its own law. And the same thing, whether you understand it a different way, which is the second way to understand that verse is, if you read that pasuk simply, what would you think? Whatever you leave over, burn in the morning. What's the morning? Tevav. That's already the first day of Pesach, right? It's a Chag. So when they say, right, don't leave it over till the morning, and then it says whatever's left in the morning should be burned. So why does it say in the morning again? It's to tell you, you burn it the next morning. You don't burn it on Tevav, on Yantif. It's not needed for Yantif. You push it off one more day and you burn it the next day. So if that's the way you read the pasuk, and that's why it repeats, and whatever's left till the morning, you should burn. So again, the mimenu is coming to say it should be burned the next morning. Okay, and that's why you need the it to refer back to the first it, and that's why. So that's what we've explained the first 3 verses. So now what about maaser? So maaser, look at Rashi again. Rashi says again, he doesn't quote you the whole thing, but lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, that was we learned already. You can't eat it when you're in one. Lo bi'arti mimenu bekodesh, that means you can't burn it if it got impure and use the fire. V'lo natati mimenu lamei. This one we didn't see yet. And I didn't give from the maaser. This is all in the vido maaser, the declaration you make. And I didn't use it for a dead person. So what are these three for? We already know they're not going to be unnecessary, any of them, because we just said there's only one unnecessary one. So chad legufe. The first one, lo achalti ba'oni mimenu, comes to say, I didn't eat this in onen, but I could eat maaser rishon ba'onen. Okay, it's to say only maaser sheni is a problem in onen, but not maaser rishon. Okay, so if I gave a Levi maaser, he could eat it even if he's an onen. Chad de Rabbi Akiva Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara doesn't even bother to tell you what this is because we saw this yesterday. What is it? Rashi tells us to permit halakha b'shemen shel truma shenitma'a. Remember, look, I can't burn this, but I can burn truma. Okay, and I can benefit from a fire of truma that got impure. What's that? The third one about the mate comes to teach you the following halacha. If it becomes impure, I can actually use oil that was from maaser sheni produce to rub it on my body. Okay, anoint my body like a moisturizer. What does this teach you? It would have to be, I can't give it to a dead person. I can't use it on a dead person, but I can use it for myself. But it would have to be in a way that's parallel that I could potentially use it for a dead person. So for example, right, eating it obviously anyway, you can't anyway, but it wouldn't be eating because a dead person can't eat. So it would have to be something, what can you do? What could you possibly use your maaser sheni for? It would be the same for a live and dead person. It would be, right, you could see taking the body, a dead body, and rubbing an oil on it. So okay, and that's what the third one is there for. So now that, right, to teach you, you can use it for sicha, right? And they got to sicha because of this logic. Now they're going to say, I could get to sicha from a different lot, right? Oh, first they're going to say it could be something else. So they say, what do you do for a dead body? You buy them a coffin, you buy them shrouds. So maybe you could take your maaser sheni produce and sell it and use the money and buy with it clothing in the canyon, right? Go to a mall, go buy clothing with it. Maybe you could do that. You don't have to necessarily say putting oil on your body. So they say, no, mimenu migufo. Mimenu sounds like from it itself, meaning you can use the goof of it. You can't use the value of it. You can use it itself like oil for putting on your body, but you can't go sell it and then use it to buy something else. Rashi brings a different proof. Amar lo natati dumia de lo achalti. Remember, these are all these things. I didn't eat from it when I was in onen. I didn't put it on a dead body. So lo achalti malala migufo. What do you do with eating? You eat the actual object. So therefore, when it says I didn't give it to a dead person, which means I could give it to a live person, it means migufo, from the item itself. So there were two ways to prove that it's obviously talking about sicha and not anything else. Rav Ashiyamal. I skipped that. Akati mufne mitzad echad. So now the Gemara goes back to this mufne. So we proved that one of the references by Pesach is unnecessary. All the others we need. So now they said it's only mufne mitzad echad, which means if you hold one side being free is enough to say you can learn gezeira shava and you can't question. But if you say you can learn a gezeira shava, but you can knock it out if you have a question, difficulty, unless there's two references that are open, then what are we going to say here? We only have one. So they say very simply, this halacha about burning truma, that you can't burn this if it became tamei, but you can burn the truma, that actually can be learned somewhere else, which would then free up that pasuk. Where can it be learned? Like Rav Nachman did. Rav Nachman says, my dichtiv, and it's just a pasuk about truma, because really it's halacha about truma that we're learning. It talks about the gifts to the kohenim. It says, I gave you the gifts of protecting my trumot. Now notice it says truma in plural. What are the two trumot? There's no like truma rishon, truma sheni, like by maaser. So, or maaser behema, maaser dagan, there is no such thing. They say it must be pure truma and impure truma, and both were given to you. What does that mean? Right, it was given to you. You can actually cook with it. Okay, you can burn your fire even with your truma tmei. And therefore, the other mimenu is free to teach this mufna, that it's free, to learn the gezeira shava, to learn that an RL can't eat maaser sheni, because we learned gezeira shava from Pesach. Okay, finished, closed topic of the RL. We're done. Now we're moving on to the next part of the Mishnah. Chol hatzmeim. Where do we get this from? That all the tmeim, right, can't eat truma. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Rabbi Yishmael, Amar Kra. Ish mizera Aharon, v'hu tzarua ozav. That's the pasuk I told you we get back to. Right? Anyone from the zera of Aharon. Okay. Now, what does it say? He's tamei, basically. Tzarua ozav is tamei. B'kodashim lo yochal ad asher yitar. Can't eat kodashim until you purify yourself. So now, what does kodashim mean? Well, we're going to see. It's not clear. Kodashim could be anything sanctified. We don't know what is included. Right? Truma is sanctified, sacrificial meat is sanctified, other things are sanctified. Right? Maaser sheni has some sanctity to it. So, ezehu davar sheshaveh b'zar'o shel Aaron. If you're going to compare it to kodashim, sacrificial meat often is only eaten by the male kohanim. Okay, there's many, like a chata goes to the male kohanim. If I bring a sin offering, my meat, the meat of the sin offering, goes to the kohen, other than the parts that get burned on the altar. The rest goes to the kohen, and it gets eaten by the male kohanim. So we need to find something that's shaveh b'zar'o shel Aaron. Instead of saying b'nei Aharon, the sons of Aaron, which usually it says, right, which means all the male kohanim, it says here zera, right, someone from zera Aharon. So they're going to say this must be something applicable to all of zera Aharon, something that all of his children can eat. Havei omer zo truma. It's only truma, because kodashim, only some of it, right? Some of the sacrificial meat that the kohanim are eating are only for the males. So therefore, it must be truma. So they say, what about ema chazev shok? Also the chazev shok, the breast and the thigh that everyone has to bring from all the, right, when there's a korban shlamim, for example, which the people get to eat the meat of, whoever brings it, they still have to give a part to the kohen. So maybe that also the women can eat. Maybe it's referring to that and not truma. And then you keep kodashim as sacrificial items, and it doesn't teach us anything about truma. Eina bechozeret. What does that mean? A bat kohen who gets married and then goes back and eats in her father's house on the event of death or divorce of her husband, she can't ever go back to eat truma v'shok, chazev v'shok. She can only go back and eat truma. So that would be a good example of something that wouldn't apply to all of Zera Aharon, because we want something that applies to all the women, even if they're chozrot, right, when they come back to their father's house. So they say, okay, well, truma nami doesn't go back to all the women. Why? Well, ena b'chalala. If a woman were to be a divorcee and she marries a kohen, which is a bat kohen to begin with, she can't go back to her father's house and eat truma there. So therefore, she's not Zera Aharon, right? Here's a case where there's truma. It's not applicable to all women. So what do they answer? Chalalav, lav zaro d'Aharon. She's already removing herself from Zera Aharon because she disgraced herself. That's not the same as someone who just happened to have gotten divorced and now can't eat chazev v'shok. So basically, we're going to say that pasuk must be referring to truma and not to kodashim because of the word Zera Aharon. Now we have another problem in the pasuk. What does it say? Here we're going to get into all the details about when you can eat what that we've been talking about before, but we're going to see them all inside. So again, let's just be very clear. This pasuk basically says, if you say kodashim is truma, then you're basically saying a person, mizera Aharon, which means that proved they were talking about truma, and he's tamei, or she is tamei, right? Either tzarua or zav. V'kodashim lo yochal ad asher yitar. They can't eat kodashim until they purify themselves. Now, it doesn't say, how do you purify yourself, right? And then I'll just read you the rest of the pasuk because we're going to get back to this. Then it's still in that same pasuk, it says, v'hanogea b'chol tmei nefesh, not just tzarua zav, but anyone, okay, who's nogea by any tmei nefesh, right? Anything that's tamei, o isha asher tisei mimenu shefatzera, or a man who has a seminal emission. So that's adding more possible tmeim situations, impure situations. So now they say, mimai dahai ad asher yitar. Now we already know, we're taking all the assumptions that we know and say, where do we get this from the verse? So we know you can't eat truma, so we just said, that comes from this verse, because kodashim is truma. We prove that from Zera Aharon. Now they say, it says until you purify yourself. How do you know that's adi kaharev shemesh? We already know, as we keep referring to that first Mishnah in Shas, that you need to wait till the sun sets. Going to the mikveh is not enough. So how do you know it's adi kaharev shemesh? Ema, first of all, they're going to say, maybe it's adimaite kapara. Well, the zav and the tzarat generally, again, depending on the situation, need to bring a sacrifice, right? If you become a mitzora muchlad, a for sure leper, or a zav who saw 3 re'iyot, right, 3 discharges, you become a zav gadol, right? You have the 7-day process of purification, and on the 8th day, you bring a sacrifice. So they say, maybe Adasher Yatar means you have to wait to eat truma till after you bring the sacrifice, right? Now, we know it's not the case, but they're suggesting from this verse, you wouldn't know. It just says until you purify yourself. Purify yourself, right? Could be one of 3 things. It could be when you go to the mikvah. It could be when the sun fully sets, Seder Kochavim, when the stars come out, and it could be after you bring your korban. So, Lo Sagadataf doesn't seem to be. Why? The Tana Rabbi Yishmael, the way Rabbi Yishmael understood this, right, from his school of thought, this pasuk is not referring to someone who brings a korban, a sacrifice. This is the zav al shtei riyot. It's talking about a zav who saw 2 discharges, or mitzora muzgar hakatum metaber, or a mitzora who was just quarantined, but in the end turned out not to be a leper. How do we know this? Because what did the end of the verse say? That's why I read you the end of the verse. Tmei nefesh, right? Dumia de tmei nefesh. Ma tmei nefesh de la bar kaparu haninami la bnei kaparanim. The end of that verse talked about anyone who's just tamei from coming in contact with a sheretz, a dead creature, something like that, which is clearly doesn't need a sacrifice, and therefore these people in the beginning of the verse must also not need sacrifices. So Rabbi Yishmael's approach to that pasuk is we're talking about someone who doesn't need a sacrifice, and that's why Adasher Yatar means Harev Shemesh. To which the Gemara is a very good question. Well, if that's the subject of the verse, then you could very simply say, okay, so Emahani Mile de Lav Bar Kapara, then it would only be referring to people who don't need a korban. And they wait only till Harev Shemesh, right? The sun sets on the night of the 8th, right? The beginning, end of the 7th day, beginning of the 8th day, that's enough. But de Bar Kapara, but those who need to bring a sacrifice on the morning of the 8th, Adamaite Kapara, maybe they would need to wait until they bring their sacrifice to enable them to eat truma. Vitu, and furthermore, since we know it's not the case, basically, and how do we know this? Because we're going to prove this Mishnah right now. Haditnan, okay, and here we're going to get, if it wasn't so clear to you, they're going to be very clear now about each category, and then we're going to see how they learn them each. Taval ba'alam, okay, so we're going to start with a person who becomes impure and also needs to bring a sacrifice. So now, day number 7 comes, they go to the mikvah, they come out of the mikvah, ochel b'maaser, you can already eat maaser sheni. Ha'eriv shimsho, next stage, sun sets, right? It's now 3 stars are out. Ochel b'truma. Person can eat truma. Hevi kapara ochel b'kodashim. Each time enables something different. And the order is maaser sheni, truma, and kodashim. We're going to get into all this soon. How do we derive this all? So that's what the Gemara is going to say. In other words, if you're going to say that this isn't referring, right, to people who have to bring a korban, and maybe people who have to bring a korban would have to wait, well, this Mishnah says they don't, but where do you get this all from? Minalan. Where is all this derived out from? Like, okay, we'll accept it, let's say, but from where? So now they're going to say like, Amarava, Amarav Chista, Tlata Krai K'tiva. We're now going to quote 3 different verses. 2 of them are from the section we were reading about the Tzarua Ozav in Vayikra Kaf Bet Dalid and in Vayikra Kaf Bet Vav. Okay? So the first one is Ish Tzarua Ozav, right? Then it says, 2 more pasukim later, I'll read the whole pasuk because they're only quoting part of it. Nefesh asher tigabo. Okay, if you touch something that's tameh, utme'a ada erev, and you become tameh, right? Tuma for a day. V'lo yochal min hakodashim ki merchatz b'saro b'mayim. Here's another pasuk that says you can't eat sanctified items until you went in the mikveh. Now, what does that seem to indicate? Going to the mikveh is enough to enable you to eat it. So that pasuk is obviously going to be referring to maaser sheni. So v'lo yochal min hakodashim ki merchatz b'saro b'mayim. Ha-rachatz tahor. From there you can infer, if you did go to the mikveh, he's tahor. Uktiv. But there's a different pasuk. In other words, we're basically going to say there's 3 pasukim that each seem to indicate something else. So this pasuk indicated mikveh is enough. Uktiv. Another pasuk, okay, this is in Vayikra Kaf Bet Zayin, the next pasuk, Ubaha Shemesh V'Tahel. Right? So on the one hand, it said, you can't eat till you go in the mikveh. The next pasuk says, but you have to wait till the sun sets entirely, and then v'taher va'achar yochal min hakodashim. So the pasuk before it seemed to indicate you can eat the kodashim as soon as you go in the mikveh. Then it says you have to wait till the sun sets. Uchtiv, and then now we're jumping to a different section in Vayikra when it talks about, and we're going to talk about this section a lot today and tomorrow, when it talks about a woman who gives birth. Okay, in Vayikra Yud Bet. Right, so she has to go through a process. What does she do? 7 and 14 days, depending male or female. Male is always half the amount. I'm not going to get into that right now. 7 days for male, 14 days for female of dam tuma. Then she has another 33 days or another 66 days. That's called Dam Tohar. After that, she goes to the mikvah, and then she can, in the morning, she brings a sacrifice on day number 81 or day number 41, okay, depending male or female, because we have the 7 plus 33 or 14 plus 66. And it says there a few things about her. So it says, the pasuk we're going to read right now is, V'chiper ala kohen b'tayira, when she brings her korban, the kohen atones for her, and she's pure. So that sounds like you only become pure after bringing a sacrifice. So how do we have these three things? Ha-ketzad. One says mikvah's enough. One says you need Rav Sheshet, and one says you need a korban. Kan maaser, kan truma, kan kochim. Okay, very simply, one is maaser, one is truma, one is kochim. So the Gemara obviously says v'ipukana. Why don't we switch it and say, so first we're going to start with truma and maaser. Maybe it's flipped. Mistabra truma adifa, right? We're going to, again, we know this already, but they're going to prove it. Maaser is the least strict, truma is the next strict, and kochim is even more strict than that. How do we know this? Shekem machfaz, it has mita, it has, right, you get the death penalty, chomesh, you have to add a fifth, it has no pidyon, you can't redeem it, and a zar can't eat it. None of those are true for maaser. So they say, adrabah, maaser adifa, and here's a new one we didn't see yesterday, shekem hadas tav. What's hadas tav? Look in Rashi. Hadas tav is hava'at makom, it needs to be brought to Jerusalem specifically. Vidoy asur la'onen. You can't do it if you're an onen. That's the dalet is vidoy. Again, these rashi tevot aren't exactly the way you would do them. Number 3, samach leva'er mimenu betuma. No, what? Oh, sorry. No, I did it wrong. Hava'at makom is 1. Vidoy, dalet is vidoy. You have to do a declaration with it, but you don't have to do it with truma. Number 3 is the samach, asur la'onen. Number 4 is tet, which is tuma, which is you can't burn it when it's tameh, and also you get lashes. We saw that yesterday. If you eat it when it's tameh. And bet is biur, you have to destroy it. But you don't have that with truma, right? If you leave it over beyond a certain time, you have to destroy it. So now, afilu hachi, so that has 5 versus 4, right? We always go by more. But they say, no. Afilu hachi mita adifa. Since you get the death penalty, right? Death by the hands of God, but you're liable for death for truma, right? If you eat it when you're impure. So therefore, that's much stricter than maaser. Okay, so that's why maaser is less strict than kochim. Rav Amar below mita adifa nami lo matidamar. Even without death, you couldn't say this either because Amar krat nefesh. It says there in that pasuk nefesh asher tigabo v'tme'ad erev, and right ki'im rachatz b'saro. That pasuk said nefesh. Nefesh sounds like everybody, right? Ezu davar sheshaveh l'chol nefesh. Hevei omer ze maaser. Truma is not shaveh l'chol nefesh. Right? Both you receive the truma only for a kohen and you give truma only for not a kohen. So here we want to find something that's including everybody because of the way the verse sounds. So and again, we've proven a bunch of ways that pasuk is maaser. But that is all talking about a person who doesn't need atonement, meaning they don't need to bring a sacrifice. Maybe you would have to wait till you actually bring the korban. So here again, they're going to prove it from the yoledet, because the yoledet has 2 verses. Remember, the yoledet clearly has to bring a woman who gives birth, has to bring sacrifices. But yet there's 2 verses. One says, Amar Bai, Trei Krai Ktivi B'Yoledet. Ktiv, Ad Milot Yimei Tahora. It says, okay, here's the pasuk. Shloshim Yom U'Shloshim Yamim Tishrei B'Dmei Tahara. B'Chol Kodesh Lo Tiga. Those 33 days or the 66, right? When your blood is actually not impure blood, which means by Torah law, you can sleep with your husband. Rabbinic law already not, but by Torah law, you could have. It says, B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga. We're going to assume B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga means no truma. How do we know this? Because it says, right? Ad Milot Yimei Tahara. She can't eat truma till she finishes all the days. Now, that sounds like Rav Sheshet. All you need to do is finish the days. Right? Once the days go by, you're good. But it also says, which sounds like you're only pure after you bring the korban. So ha-ketzad, again, kan the truma, kan the kochim. That's how we're going to know when it said the whole kodesh lo tigader, it must be talking about truma. And when it says the kohen, you have to bring your sacrifice, and only then can you eat, that's talking about the sacrifice. To which they again are going to say, v'ipochana, why don't we say the opposite? Well, mistabra kodesh hamor sheken, pancakes, right? I saw some jokes about it, the pancakes, right? That's how you remember this. That Pei, Pigul, Notar, Korban, Me'ila, Karet, Asur La'onen. I'm not going to go through them right now, but those are the 6 we saw yesterday. They're going to say it just as they did yesterday. Well, Adraba, Truma Chamura Shekei Machpaz, 4 we just talked about. Hanach Nefishan, right? The list is longer by Kodshim. And Rava Amar below Hanach Nefishan, even if you didn't have numbers. Lo, right, that one was more than the other. Lo Matzit Amar Cheken Amar Kra. Lo Matzit Amar because Amar Kra. V'chiper Alea Kohen V'Tahera. Michlal Shehi Tme'ah. Now it sounds like she's still impure. Now, Isa Kedata Pekodshim, Ikrekan, Habasal Asher Tiga Bechol Tameh Lo Ye'achel, Ela Shmamina B'Truma. If it's Kodshim, it already says, right? It sounds like she's still Tme'ah from something. And what is she still Tme'ah? Well, it says, Habasal, if anything touches Bechol Tameh Lo Yiga, which is talking about Kodshim. So therefore, it's clear that Kodshim, she's still impure when it relates to Kodshim. So therefore, we're going to assume she can't eat the Kodshim, but she can't eat the Truma. So we've now proven, and we're going to end with one last question. We've proven that Pesach by the Yoled, that is B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga, is talking about Truma, okay? And the other Pesach by the Yoled is talking about Kodshim. And now we've proven maaser from the first Pasuk, not in the Yoled, that in Vayikra Kafet, was talking about maaser. All you need is Rachat Pesaro B'mayim. Harev Shemesh that was there goes together with the Yoled Pasuk here and proves Truma can be eaten after Harev Shemesh. That you just have to wait ad the melot yameim, right? The end of that day. And then the kodshim, you have to wait till the sacrifice. Comes the Gemara with one last question, and we'll leave you with a question. You're going to say that pasuk is talking about truma, right? Matkav la Rav Sheshet bered Rav Idi about the Yoled. Umi matzid amar truma k'tivah. How could you say it's talking about truma there? V'hatanya daber el b'nei Yisrael. That section started when it said Isha ki tazriya v'yalda zachar, a woman who gives birth and then has a boy, and then if she has a girl, and all those laws. It says B'nai Yisrael, speak to. Now, it says, Ein li ela B'nai Yisrael. It sounds like it's only referring to the wives of B'nai Yisrael. But how do we know it also relates to a convert, someone who wasn't born into the Jewish people, or a maidservant who was freed and now is Jewish? Well, right, all the same laws of Yoled that will apply to them as well. Talmud Lomar Isha. Starts with B'nai Yisrael, it sounds like everyone born Jew. Now they say even other people who came into Judaism. So now we have a big question. If you're going to say the pasuk is referring to truma, B'chol Kodesh Lo Tiga is truma, well, they don't need truma, right? The only way to eat truma is to marry a kohen. They can't marry a kohen. So they don't need truma. So this can't be how could you say the section that includes all sorts of people who can't eat truma is talking about truma? Would be strange. Not exactly, because it's also including people who do, and we'll get to that in tomorrow's shiur. So wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll meet up after Shabbat.